Shalom, peace, salam. Our speaker needs no introduction. All we have to do is Google him, and you'll find pages and pages. But I want to emphasize that he was a leader among centrist Republicans. He was an advocate and still is an advocate of socially moderate views. He's had reduced crime for the United States. He led the charge to end racial profiling way back and sexual discrimination in the workplace. He helped author the 1993 Gun Control Act and advocated a sensible, and still advocates, a sensible assault weapons ban reauthorization bill. He's a former Peace Corps, etc., etc., etc. But there is something that nobody knows about, and that's personal. I would like to share it with you. I came to this country because I fled Lebanon. There were 3 attempts on my life because I was a moderate Muslim by extremists. That was in the 80s. I applied for my citizenship, and there was a job. I need to go and work at the nuclear base in Groton. They will not accept a person who will not given clearance if I had a green card. So I went to the INS in Hartford and I said, you know what, my application, we lost it. Well, can you get it? No, because we don't have any more employees. President Reagan didn't give us any more employees. Can I apply again? No, we can't apply again. It was this. So I called a senator and a representative, Chris Shays. Never heard from the senator. Chris immediately gave me an appointment. I met with him. Within 2 days, I had a copy of his letter to the INS. I was called for the interview within a week. This is service, and I'm grateful to him for making it easy for me. In our Islamic, Arabic, and Lebanese culture, when somebody does something good for us, we recognize him in public. It's my pleasure to introduce Chris Shays, a friend and a brother.
So I have sinned, and I asked if there was a priest here, and there isn't, so I then said to Rabbi Tarav, do you take confession? And he said yes. The only problem was, when I was done with my confession, I said, so am I forgiven? And he said, no, I only take confession so I can tell people. So now you will be told. I realized that 2 years ago, I went into a store, I had a credit, and I bought 2 ties. I looked down at the tie, and it says Donald Trump. So I'm only telling you because I know he would tell you. And it's kind of disappointing because I have always felt that when I am in the Jewish community, I'm in a safe place. So if the title of my 10-minute talk is known, it would be something like, something needs to be asked of all of us, Muslims, Christians, Jews, and people of other faiths and beliefs. That would be my title. And the question I have tonight, which we may not have an answer to, is, what is it that we want and can accomplish together? And I might just add another question, how do we go about doing it? So what is it that we can accomplish together that is truly a blessing? Speaking of blessings, Stanford has been a blessing to my wife Betsy, my daughter Jeremy, and me. And I hope living and working in Stanford has been a blessing for all of you. Stanford is where I grew up as an adult and lived for 29 years. Stanford is where I gained my political spurs, first as an elected state representative for 13 years and then as a member of Congress for 21 years. Stanford is where I saw firsthand that when people pool their knowledge and resources and work together, good most often is the overwhelming result. I learned that living in Stanford. In Stanford, I learned early on that there are far more things that unite us as a people than divide us. It's really true. This is a very unique community. I'm going to give you two examples. When I was campaigning for state representative, on the same day, off High Ridge Road, I represented about half of the town, about a fifth of the population. And I was taking a survey, and I was not yet a representative. I was a candidate. And I came to this house with a very young woman with young children. I knew that she was a Democrat, and I frankly thought she was probably Jewish. And she fit my stereotype, and it wasn't a bad stereotype, but she fit my stereotype because she talked about all the social needs that we have in this community. And I kind of thought, well, that's kind of what I thought she would tell me. And then she said, but I don't like programs that waste money. And then she started to talk about the waste in government. That same day, I went down a street and around a street, and I came to an old house. I came to a gentleman that was either Mr. Matthew or Mr. Mather. He was a Republican, that's what my book said. I pegged him as an Episcopalian, and he fit my stereotype. He started to talk about all the waste in government, and it was just what I expected. And then he said these words, I'll never forget it. But, young man. He was talking about all the waste in government, but he said, but, young man, I don't like knowing how I live here, knowing how folks live down there, pointing to downtown Stanford. And he said, we have to address the human need. And I was just struck that day with just this unbelievable thought that these two very different people, different faiths, different parties, young, old, they weren't that far apart. And it was something that stuck with me the rest of my life in politics, because they weren't that far apart. Now, they may not admit it, but they weren't. And then as a member of Congress, I would sometimes stay in a homeless shelter, spend the night. I never told the press. I even had a community meeting in a homeless shelter. And I thought, there by the grace of God goes me. They were so real to me. They were some very well educated. But even those that weren't well educated were thoughtful. And it was just a wonderful lesson for me to think anyone at Stanford could be there under certain circumstances. We weren't that far apart, even though they were homeless. But the real thing that struck me is I represented such a wealthy district and such a district with a lot of poor people, poor in money. And my staff had scheduled me to go to a Father Panic Village. It was an old facility where people were living on welfare, and I was to meet, believe it or not, a prostitute inflicted with AIDS, because the social worker wanted me to understand how we were trying to prevent the spread of AIDS. And I'm going back to the early 90s. And I thought, this is kind of a weird experience. And I went there, and this woman was not all that attractive. She looked sick, and she was still in business. And she was one of the nicest people I've ever met in my life. She made me laugh. She made me cry. And I thought, there by the grace of God goes any one of us who would have led the life she led. I was a little annoyed with my staff because they scheduled this and didn't leave as much time as I then wanted. And I was to go all the way down the Merritt Parkway, up North Avenue, up to Conyers Farm, to go to a polo match for some fundraising. And I was really annoyed about it. And almost a little embarrassed. And as I was driving up there, I was driving down the road, and I saw Mercedes and Rolls Royces and small cars, large cars, very expensive, women getting out with vintage Victorian clothes. And I thought, oh my goodness. Until I looked at the sign. And it was a fundraiser for people inflicted with AIDS. And I thought, in their way, they were reaching out to the very person that I got to visit that they would never get to visit. And I thought, rich and poor, there's something that connects us. And it was a valuable lesson. And when I think about it, even tell you, I get a little teary-eyed. Now, one of the biggest complaints of elected officials is that they seem to change once they're elected to office. Frankly, if they are doing their job, they better change. Because, I use the word representative. Representative. That means they have to represent the people they're meeting with that they may never have met before. So, the reason they should change is change comes from discovering new things and responding to new knowledge. That is one of the reasons I loved my job, serving in Congress. Every day I learned something new. I absolutely love that. And I had withdrawal after I was no longer a member of Congress because I didn't have those daily experiences. But part of the process of learning comes from the fact that to be an effective representative, you need to develop a strong ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And there used to be this, my mom used to tell me, you need to walk a mile in someone's moccasins. So you need to develop this sense of knowing what it's like for someone else. That's what it's like to be a representative. You don't always vote the way they want you to vote. You can't, because people disagree. But you at least need to understand why they want you to vote a certain way. In other words, you need to develop a strong sense of empathy. In my judgment, that is what is needed now from all of us. And I'm going to expose my ignorance. I need to have empathy for everyone in this room. I'm not a Muslim. I don't know so much about that faith, but I know what I read. And you can be sure that it's not always accurate. The answer to what we can accomplish together requires our willingness to learn new things and our willingness to be empathetic, to understand and appreciate the lives and cultures of people we know little about. The answer to what we can accomplish together also requires straight talk as opposed to political correctness. Not mean or unkind talk, but honest talk. In my judgment, political correctness prevents us from learning and growing. Being politically correct will fool us into thinking everything is just fine, when all we may do is cover up what needs to be addressed and frankly healed. Recently, I was at a dinner in New York with a number of pastors, and I'm just going to explain the lesson about political correctness. And they were servicing the Latino community, many who are here illegally. And they expressed the term, we have so many undocumented workers. And I said to them, being politically incorrect, I have trouble with that term. They're illegal aliens. That's what I said. I said they're not undocumented workers, they're illegal aliens. So tell me why you call them undocumented workers. And the kindness of these reverends was the following. They said, well, let me explain it this way. They may be here illegally, but they're not aliens. Aliens almost makes them seem like they're from outer space. And it made sense to me. So I don't say illegal aliens anymore, but I would have if I had been politically correct and just kept my mouth shut. I learned from that conversation. Now, I felt it was a safe place to say that. And what I am also advocating is we need to create a safe place for people to say what may not be politically correct, and maybe you think this is the same thing. We need to create a safe place for people to expose their ignorance. So you can gently correct and enlighten them. I will tell you, I have learned quite often the most when I asked a question that some might have thought was dumb, but I needed to know the answer. And in Congress, they would tell us, don't ask the question unless you know the answer. Well, I think that's dumb. But the reason why they told me that was because I'm supposed to take a position and advocate it, and therefore I want to act like a lawyer and try to prove my case, and don't ask a question that may not prove your case. The reason I attended those hearings was to learn, not to prove a case. So now I'm going to get into a little more difficult conversation. I don't know about you, but I think the world is a frankly scary place. And I remember the mayor telling me one time he didn't think it was. But I think it is, because of the threats we face and the failure to address them. Ironically, the epic Cold War has ended, and the symbol of that war, the Berlin Wall, has taken down brick by brick. But the world is truly a more dangerous place as I see it. The dangers we face are real, life-threatening, and growing. And I'm saying that to you to help you understand why some Americans react the way they react. The world is threatened by the hijacking of the Muslim faith, by extreme ideology, those who would do us and the world great harm. The simple fact is, however, we're concerned about the utter brutality of Al-Qaeda or Boko Haram or ISIL or ISIS, as we could call it, and the attempt to create a caliphate state in Syria and Iraq are as big a concern to the Muslim community as they are to the non-Muslim community. The fleeing of so many refugees, in my judgment, is an indication of that fact. Unfortunately, the concern of the Muslim community is not being heard, and it needs to be. And frankly, a good example is there's really no press covering this. There's no press hearing what a Muslim might say about what they're seeing, which gives me sympathy for them, because I encountered it all the time when Republicans or Democrats would say, "Why aren't you saying this?" And I would say to them, "I am. It's just not getting covered. It doesn't mean I'm not saying it." There are so many Muslims throughout the country who are speaking out, and no one hears or sees them. Unfortunately, Saudi Arabia continues to spread its virulent Wahhabism doctrine throughout the world, in spite of the fact, in the end, they are the ones most threatened by it. Unfortunately, some politicians, Donald Trump in particular, make outrageous comments and attacks, really, on Muslims, playing to a majority, knowing that Muslims are a small minority within the United States. So I need to just box in this little comment. Donald Trump is everything my mother and father taught me not to be. So, being politically incorrect a little longer, Donald Trump has an audience because non-Muslim Americans see Europe awash with Muslim youth who seem discontent with Western society and seem willing to bring it down. That's a fact. Americans see two separate societies at war and fear that Muslims in the United States will not carry on the practice of assimilating and blending with Americans who came before them. I'm not saying it's true, but that's what they see. And if we don't say it, we're not going to address it. we're just going to cover it up and act like it doesn't exist. And then we haven't solved anything. And frankly, most Americans who aren't Muslim fear Sharia law that seems so foreign to our laws and practices, and wonder how a Muslim who is practicing their faith can be true if they're not practicing Sharia law. I was just in Sudan, and we helped get a woman out a year and a half ago because she was a Muslim who became a Christian, and she was arrested because she wasn't allowed to be a Christian under Sharia law in Sudan. That's what Americans see. And that's why it's difficult for them to appreciate the Muslims who may live in their community when they don't know them. Bottom line, the majority of Americans see the minority as different than the minorities that preceded them. They need to not only see Muslims speak out against atrocities committed in the name of the Quran, they need to learn what an integrated Muslim society is it compatible with their faith. They look overseas and see what's happened and say they don't want it here. That's the challenge. And I raise that, and I know we're not going to have a conversation now, but I'm going to stay here until everyone is left. I'll be the last standing. Because I would love that dialogue with folks here and folks there. And what I'm asking Americans to do is to express their inner concerns to people who can answer them. And from that, we'll have a better society. And let me just conclude by saying that this is an amazing town. You can cope with any challenge that comes your way. And I know that because I've lived in a number of places. And if I had one regret in my life, it was that I moved from Stanford to another town and didn't stay here when I was still a member of Congress. That's my biggest regret politically, and I have confessed that to all of you, not just the rabbi.